The lecture that we're going to start today is on East Asia. Primarily, we're going to focus on China and Japan, but we are going to talk a little bit about Korea. So with this, we're going to talk about the continuities and changes over time with East Asia, particular to China. When we discussed China last, we were talking about it being under the control of the Mongols. Okay, Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, had established a dynasty in China known as the Yuan Dynasty. Now, looking at this date range, 1271 to 1368, which period in our curriculum is that relevant to? The first period, because period 1 is 1250 to 1450. Now, when you're writing an essay or an SAQ, don't refer to the time span as, in period 1, okay? Because that means different things for different classes. Our period 1 starts in 1250. Mr. Farquhar's AP Euro starts in 450 for period 1, okay? So we're in different time periods. Don't just say period 1, period 2, because outside of this class, that means nothing, okay? Say 1250 through 1750 or whatever your time span is. So that's period 1 with the Mongols. Now we know that the Mongols are very good at conquering, but they're not so great at administration. So about 100 years after the death of Genghis Khan, you're going to see his empire kind of crumble and go back to its native culture. So that's where we get the Ming Dynasty. Now 1368, that's period 1. But then this dynasty ends in 1644, which is in what period? Period 2. So 1450 to 1750 is period 2. So the Yuan Dynasty is period 1, moving into period 2 with the Ming Dynasty. And then we move from the Ming to the Qing Dynasty, which is 1644, which is period 2, moving into period 3, and then moving out of period 3 into 1911. So the reason I say that is that we are covering China in all of the periods in our curriculum. Okay, so some of this is going to be review, some of it's going to be context, some of it's going to be brand new information, but it's important to know how they all connect. So rather than us just breaking it up into period 1, 2, and 3, we're going to talk about all of China and this information, touch on some stuff that you already know about, and then add some additional information. Now, what's notable about these dynasties is that the Yuan Dynasty was foreign. The Mongols were not Chinese. They're from the steppes. They come over and conquer the Song Dynasty, which is Chinese. So you go from a Chinese dynasty to a foreign dynasty. Then the Yuan Dynasty is kicked out by the Ming. This is native Chinese dynasty. Okay, so they start reestablishing traditional Chinese culture in China again for the next 300 years. Unfortunately, they are going to lose power to yet another foreign invasion, and that establishes the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty was established by the Manchu from Manchuria. They're going to invade and take over and once again eliminate some aspects of native Chinese culture. So if we're looking at the historical thinking scale of similarities versus differences, the Yuan Dynasty was foreign, the Qing Dynasty was foreign. The Ming Dynasty was the only one that was native to China. Now, the Qing Dynasty is going to quash a lot of traditional cultures and beliefs within China, and that's going to lead to a revolution. It leads to the White Lotus Rebellion, but that's going to be unsuccessful. It's very violently put down. So the Qing are going to remain in power until we get the revolution and then eventually the Communist Party of China with Mao Zedong. So speaking of, I have this dynasty song to help us remember the order of the dynasties. Are y'all familiar with the tune Frère Jacques? Frère Jacques, dormez-vous. Okay, we're going to do that. We're going to do some karaoke. Shang Zhou Qin Han, Shang Zhou Qin Han, say tang song, Yan Ming Qing Republic, Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong. I assume those of you at home were singing along. Or y'all like dances like, this slaps. This is better than the Kahoot music. All right, so we talked about the mystical Shang Dynasty. Don't have a lot of information about them because this is before period 1. The mighty Zhou Dynasty is also before period 1, but we covered these dynasties as context for period 1. So the Qin Dynasty, we remember as very brief and very brutal. Do y'all remember the leader of the Qin dynasty? It was Shi Huangdi. So Emperor Shi Huangdi, he established the Qin dynasty and he enforced the policy of legalism, which is very brutal, very dictatorial. If you broke the law, the punishment's basically death. Okay, so that kind of level of extreme enforcement of the law. Now, because of that, he was not very popular. Okay, he built the Great Wall of China, which is a plus. That's great infrastructure, but he also threw a lot of dead people into the wall and buried them in it. So, and then he burned some scholars alive. It's like overall kind of problematic. So the Qin dynasty got canceled and it was replaced by the Han dynasty, which is going to be a period of prosperity. This is the dynasty that focuses on Confucianism. This is the dynasty that starts the civil service exams, forming a meritocracy in the Chinese government. Y'all, it is important to remember that the major continuity in Chinese history is Confucianism. Okay, you can't talk about China in any of the time periods without talking about Confucianism. So we see the establishment of a civil service bureaucracy, the scholar gentry within the Chinese government, but then the Han dynasty falls apart and we have a period of anarchy. The Sui dynasty is going to reunite China under centralized rule, but it's going to do that by being like the Qin dynasty, which is problematic because people don't like being oppressed. So like the Qin dynasty, the Sui dynasty is going to be very short-lived. It's only like 40 years. Then we hit China's golden age, the Tang and the Song dynasties. Y'all may remember the Tang dynasty being known as the Middle Kingdom. What does that mean? That China was the Middle Kingdom. Exactly. They are the center. They are the most important thing. They are superior and everyone else is inferior. Okay, so they have all the best technology. They have all of the best goods. Their economy is awesome. They have tributary states like Japan and Korea and Vietnam. So China was doing really, really well under the Tang dynasty. But then the Song dynasty started and they start spending more money in the treasury, especially as the bureaucracy expands and you have a lot of scholar gentry. And y'all may remember that the scholar gentry were put in charge of the military. Now, the scholar gentry were trained in Confucianist thought. That's what you studied to take the civil service exam. But they weren't really trained in military expertise. And so when they go up against the Mongols, they're going to lose big. This is where we move into the Yuan dynasty, which is where we last left off. All right, so moving into the Ming. As the Mongols are kicked out of China and the native Chinese dynasty reestablishes control, we're going to see China enter into another prosperous time period. Okay, their economy is going to expand. The region is going to become stabilized under their rule for the next 300 years. So we're going to give evidence of this expansion of the economy under the Ming Dynasty. We know that following the conquest by the Mongols, trade increased under the Pax Mongolica, particularly on what trade route? The Silk Road, exactly right. So trade is booming. Okay, now China is going to be exporting mostly luxury goods. What are some examples of luxury goods that they sell? Yeah, porcelain, silk, tea, paper, gunpowder. All of those are luxury goods that they export to other countries. They're going to export more than they import, which is a good look for an empire. You always want to sell more than you buy. Okay, so their economy is going to expand. They're going to sell a lot of silk and porcelain and other luxury goods. Who's going to be buying those luxury goods? Who has a lot of gold and silver that they came to suddenly? Europe does, exactly. How did they get all that gold and silver that they were using to buy goods? From the Americas, from the New World. They established the encomienda system to make Native Americans mine gold and silver, and then later the asiento system for the cash crops grown on plantations. So Spain and Portugal are getting a ton of bullion, and they're turning around and spending it in China in exchange for these luxury goods. So China indirectly benefits from the Columbian exchange. Okay, they don't have to suffer the same inflation as the Spanish either. So everything's going well for them. However, is there a high demand for European goods in China? No. Okay. And so eventually the Europeans are going to notice this. They're going to be like, wait, we're buying all this stuff from China and they're not buying any of our stuff. So we're importing more than we're exporting. And that is bad news bear for our economy. And so they're going to get pretty salty about that. So they're like, fine, we need to find something to sell to the Chinese. And so that's when England starts becoming a drug dealer. They colonize India. They start growing not only cotton, but also opium in India after it's colonized. And then they start forcing that opium into China. Like the Chinese government was like, can you please not put your drugs here? Can you please stop forcing us to do drugs? And the British Empire is just like, no, buy more drugs. And China's like, no, I say no to drugs. They're like, no, just do the drugs. And so when the British insist on sending these ships to China, and they're like, hey, buy it, the Chinese set them on fire. And the British Empire gets super mad because they're like, hey, that's our property. You owe us money for burning our drugs. And China's like, we literally didn't ask for this. We asked for the opposite of this. And then we have the opium wars between China and Britain. Actually, there are going to be multiple opium wars. Okay, so right now, China's doing awesome economically and politically. They are a powerhouse. But then in period 3, with the beginnings of industrialization, Europe starts rising to power and starts threatening Asia. Okay, starts colonizing in Asia. And China is not going to be an exception to that. Now we see in this large empire under the Ming, we have 2 capitals, a northern capital and a southern capital. The northern capital of Beijing is where the royal family, the emperor, and the court is going to live within a walled compound known as the Forbidden City. Okay, so this is where their palaces are. The southern capital is going to be in Nanjing. So this is a centralized government. They all report back to an emperor. Now, once that Chinese emperor, instead of a Mongol emperor, takes over China again, he's going to work very, very hard to return China to its roots, to its heritage. They're going to be conservative and traditional. So kick out the Mongols and erase the influence that they had over China. Because when the Mongols were in charge, they didn't focus on Confucianism. They hyped up Buddhism. They got rid of the civil service exam. They didn't allow Chinese people to hold positions of power in the bureaucracy. So the Chinese were pretty salty over the whole Mongol dynasty time period. And so they're going to try to erase that as much as possible. First off, they're going to promote Confucianism. Again, this is a major continuity. Now, is Confucianism a religion? No, it's a what? It is a philosophy. Good. So can it exist in tandem with Buddhism or Christianity or Islam? Yeah, they don't threaten each other. It's a philosophy versus a religion. Okay, and this is the main philosophy that permeates most of Chinese society, as we're going to see when we get to social structure. So with civil service exams, this is going to help promote Confucianism because guess what you have to study in order to get a job in the government? You have to study Confucianism. Exactly right. Now, the Mongols didn't have the civil service exam. And so this is going to be a reinstatement of that meritocracy. Meritocracy meaning that you promote people based on their qualifications rather than just on who they know or who they are or how much money they have. Now, Europe was very impressed by this meritocracy. Y'all may remember Europe was going through the Enlightenment. You know, Peter the Great tried to implement a meritocracy in his military. But for the most part, Europe focused a lot on the aristocracy. They focused a lot on titles and divine right and feudalism. Okay, and so China is going to seem a lot more advanced in comparison, that they have a government that's based on qualification rather than just, oh, this is the oldest son and he gets everything and he inherits this title. Okay, so that's going to be very impressive to the Europeans, in addition to the level of education within China. There is an emphasis on education in China. Okay, the highest members of society under the emperor were the scholar gentry. You had to work very, very hard and study very, very hard to become a scholar gentry and to get this position in the government. So you got a lot of status and clout and wealth. So education is a big thing in China. They're going to improve education by establishing a national school system, which to y'all, you may be like, okay, yeah, public school. What else is new? We've been in it all our lives. But this is a fairly recent development, even in the United States. Y'all may remember that in period 1 and period 2 of our specific curriculum, education was very expensive. Books were expensive, and they were rare. Teachers were expensive. Tutors were expensive. So if you were educated, it meant you were wealthy, that you had it like that, because you could afford to buy the books and buy the tutors and all of that. So it'd be like nobles and higher ups in society who would be literate and educated. Now you're taking away that economic barrier. You're making a larger percentage of your population able to access education and then move up in terms of social mobility. Okay, do you want your population to be more educated? Yeah, that's typically seen as a positive thing. Okay, so we see this emphasis on education in China as they reestablish their native Chinese bureaucracy that had fallen into disuse while the Mongols were in charge. So we see a lot of change and continuity here, depending on how you word it. You could say there was a change from the Mongols to the Ming Dynasty, or you could say there was a continuity because of most of Chinese history. There's a focus on Confucianism. It just depends on how you word it. But this is definitely going to fall under continuity and change under time. Now, like all empires, the Ming Empire is going to expand militarily, but this is going to be a temporary expansion. Specifically, they're going to try to expand into Mongol territory. Now, the Mongols no longer controlled the largest contiguous land empire on Earth, but they weren't completely eradicated, okay? They still had some territory up in the steppe lands. And so the Ming Dynasty is going to move into Mongolia and Central Asia in the interest of expansion. Well, the Mongols were down, but they weren't out. In the 1440s, they're going to rise again, go back to their military strategies of faking retreats and using siege weapons, being very cunning with military strategy, and they're going to put up a good fight against the Ming Dynasty. So good, in fact, that the Khan ends up kidnapping the Emperor of China. So not a good look for China. The Khan is like, oh yeah, I got a bargaining chip. I'm going to ask them for A, B, and C and all of this so they can get their emperor back, because that's a big deal. So he goes to the government and he says, hey, I got your emperor. If you want him back, then you need to do this. And what he didn't expect was the government to say, we don't negotiate with terrorists and you can keep him. They're like, wait, what? You don't want your emperor back? And you're like, yeah, no, he has a brother. We already crowned him. We already put his brother in charge. So like we got a new emperor, like straight out of the box. Like so. And you can think of how this would make sense under the mandate of heaven. I mean, under the mandate of heaven, if bad things are happening to you, then you probably don't have the God's favor. So you've been losing these battles against the Mongols, then you get yourself captured by the Mongols. That's probably the God sending a sign to find another leader. So now the Mongol Khan is like, well, what am I supposed to do with this emperor? That he's useless to me now. But he doesn't kill him. He actually tries to marry him off to his sister. And the emperor's like, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. I'm good. I'm fine without marrying into your family. Like, no offense. And eventually the Khan is just going to let him go because like he's useless to him. He's got to let him go back home. So the Mongols do not rise again, but they do harass the Ming Dynasty. But because of this, the Ming Dynasty says, okay, look, we need to beef up our defensive infrastructure. We need fortifications. And what's the most famous fortification in China? The Great Wall of China started under the Qin Dynasty. And so they start restoring and expanding this wall. Now, when the Mongols were in charge, they weren't really concerned with keeping up the Great Wall because the purpose of the Great Wall was to keep Mongol invaders out. And they were already in. They're like, we don't need to keep us out. We're good. And so once the Mongols are pushed out of the main Chinese empire, that's when the Ming Dynasty is going to start bolstering up this infrastructure again. So here we see another example of a historical thinking skill, causation. Because of the Mongol armies in 1440 and how well they did in battle and capturing the emperor, the Ming Dynasty is going to invest in expanding that wall, okay, to fend off northern invasions. Now, is this going to keep them protected forever? No. The Manchu are going to come in and they're going to take over and establish the Qing Dynasty. But, I mean, the Ming Dynasty does last for about 300 years. So So the Ming Dynasty is living its best life. They have a lot of clout, they have a lot of prestige, they have a lot of power. And part of this is because of their massive treasure fleet. This is going to be a huge navy, not just for the purpose of battling, not just for fighting people in the ocean, but also for the purpose of collecting stuff from their tributary states. Okay, remember that governments make money through taxes, trade, and tribute. So they're doing a throwback to the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty collected tribute. The Ming Dynasty is going to collect tribute. So Emperor Yongle, I know it's spelled Yongle. If you want to pronounce it that way to help you remember how to spell it, that's fine. I'm pretty sure it's Yongle. He is going to create this fleet of ships, and he's going to place a Muslim eunuch at the head of it, Zhang Ha. Zhang Ha is a contemporary of Christopher Columbus. They were alive at the same time. But as you can see in this comparison, Zhang Ha's ship is much, much bigger than Christopher Columbus's ship. And Zhang Ha actually did some exploring. He didn't just sail west and fail upward, landing in a new continent. All right, so this is supposed to display the might and the prestige or the clout of the Ming Dynasty. They go out and collect tribute from these lands, including like they go to Africa and get like giraffes and lions and all this exciting things and bring it back to like the Royal Zoo in the Forbidden City. And so this is all to show off how powerful the Ming Dynasty is. So it gains them prestige and it also gains them new markets. So good for the economy. All right, but what about socially? Y'all may remember that the Ming Dynasty wanted to restore Chinese culture. They wanted to get rid of foreign influences. Well, if you're trading with everybody, then you're probably coming into contact with their foreign influence, with their foreign culture. And that might dilute or pollute the superior Chinese culture. Okay, obviously from the perspective of the Ming Dynasty, much like the Tang, they're going to view their culture as the best and everyone else as inferior. So how are the Chinese going to view the Europeans? As barbarians, as inferior. How are they going to view the Mongols? As inferior. Okay, this is just the mindset that's there. So to prevent this foreign, flashy lifestyle that detracts from their Confucianist values, you're eventually going to see a change over time where the Ming Dynasty shuts this treasure fleet down and says, we can't afford to do this anymore. It's a threat to our hierarchy. We want to maintain a stable agrarian society under Confucianist ideals. We don't need these flashy foreign cultures coming in and polluting what we have. And so later emperors, like the son of Yongle, Zhu Gaoji, ended these expeditions and also highly discouraged sailing away from China. So we see the beginnings of a period of isolationism within the Ming Dynasty. So like the Islamic gunpowder empires, the Ming Dynasty is going to isolate. They're going to try to preserve their traditional beliefs and culture. They're successful in that until the Industrial Revolution. Who's going to become very powerful during the Industrial Revolution? Europe. The Industrial Revolution starts in Britain. Remember that new imperialism goes hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution, because as they need more raw materials for their factories, they start colonizing. Where do they colonize? Africa and Asia. So they no longer, okay, the Ming Dynasty ended this. They no longer have this treasure fleet to go up against the boats of the British that come knocking or the boats of the United States. This is called gunboat diplomacy. The United States is going to show up in Japan, for instance, with metal ships, steamships, mounted with metal guns. And the Japanese have samurai swords and muskets. It's not going to be a fair fight. Same thing with China. They cut themselves off. They try to preserve their traditional culture, and it works for a while until the Industrial Revolution, where they start falling behind, and Europe starts taking advantage of them. Now, the issue with this is that they cut themselves off, or they isolated themselves from the rest of the world. So whereas the rest of the world, like Europe, was industrializing and building steamboats and better guns like machine guns, China and Japan, not so much. They weren't modernizing as much. Similar to how the Muslim gunpowder empires failed to modernize because they wanted to preserve their traditions and culture. The only gunpowder empire that did rapidly modernize through westernization was Russia. Exactly right, Mother Russia. Okay, so that's an important distinction. That's historical significance. What's the historical significance of this treasure fleet? Well, it was really good for China at first, but in trying to preserve their traditional culture and Confucianist values, they shut it down. And there were some unintended negative effects from that in terms of European imperialism in Asia. Oh, another benefit of this is that the treasure fleet actually helped stop piracy in the trade routes that the Chinese control. So the pirates are like, when those ships rolled up, they were like, okay, let's go to the Mediterranean Sea. I don't think this is a good idea. Like there's like 70 of those big ships. We're just gonna slide on out unnoticed. It's like, let's go to the Americas and pirate stuff. Just showing the difference, even though Columbus and Zheng He were contemporaries. All right, so when it comes to maritime empires in the Indian Ocean, okay, we're going to have Europeans very, very interested in the Indian Ocean trade. Why is that? Spices. They want access to the spice trade. And at first, they had to go through the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire acted as the middlemen for this spice trade, and they jacked up the prices. So the Europeans were like, what if we cut out the middleman and instead we find a route to the spice trade? Which European country found that route first? Portugal. Okay, which explorer found it? Starts with a V. Vasco da Gama, exactly right. So he went around Africa. This is Portugal, teeny tiny on the Iberian Peninsula, very, very small country, but a very, very large maritime empire. So it goes all the way around Africa to get to India, to get to the spice trade. In addition to building their empire in India, they're also going to build their empire in the Americas, and primarily what is now today known as Brazil. So very tiny country, lots of empire to manage. That's going to be a problem. So keep that foreshadowing in mind. So as the Portuguese made their way around Africa to India, okay, they couldn't just colonize the land that they came across. Why couldn't the Europeans colonize Africa? Why were they stuck on the coastline instead of the interior of Africa? Malaria, that was a push factor. Europeans were not immune to malaria like the Bantu people were. And so if they tried to invade the mighty empires of Africa, then they would be pushed back by that. What's another factor that played a role in why they couldn't conquer Africa? What, baby? Exactly right. The African empires were equal or superior to the European empires in terms of military strategy and weaponry. Same thing with China. The Asian empires had the same military technology as the Europeans, so they were equally matched. Europeans don't want to pick on somebody who's equally matched. They want to pick on somebody that they could easily dominate. And who is that going to be? The Native Americans. What allows them to conquer the Native Americans and dominate them? The fact that they have guns. Do the natives have guns? No, because this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, had been completely cut off from the Eastern Hemisphere until 1492. Okay, what else did the Native Americans lack? The biggest factor in their decline. Immunity. Immunity to diseases like smallpox. Okay, so you have smallpox and guns. That allows the Portuguese and the Spanish an edge when it comes to colonizing and exploiting the New World. They do not have that edge in Africa. They are resigned to establishing trading post empires along the coast of Africa. They do not have that edge in China. Okay, so they have to play nice if they want to get China on their side. So they find a monopoly on the spice trade by going around Africa to get to India, but they can't dominate in this area like they could in the New World for the reasons that we have just discussed. So now if the Portuguese want to build a relationship with China, they can't go in guns a-blazing. They have to go in diplomatically. So they are going to try to create a cultural link through conversion to their religion. And we've seen this before, y'all. The Byzantine Empire needed an ally, and so they sent missionaries where? To spread Eastern Orthodoxy. To the Kievan Rus, exactly right. And that gained the Byzantine Empire an ally to the north. They were linked culturally. So now Portugal's going to try the same thing with China. Now, what religion do the Portuguese follow? They are Catholic, exactly right. Y'all, this Iberian Peninsula, super duper Catholic. Portugal and Spain, they're like the most Catholic. In fact, the most Catholic of the Catholics was the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuit order, founded by Ignatius Loyola following the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Jesuits had 3 goals. First goal, eradicate heresy. And heresy was anything that was not Catholicism. So Protestants were included, other Christians were included. The second goal was to spread the gospel. So proselytize, send missionaries. The third goal was to expand education. The Jesuits are very well known for their renowned colleges and universities within Europe. So with those 3 goals, they have to try to get China to like them. Well, they can't go in with number 1, eradicate heresy, because China would squash them. They can go in, however, with spreading the gospel and spreading education. And so the Chinese are going to respect the Jesuits because that respect goes 2 ways. Okay, so how did the Jesuits respect Chinese culture? Well, number 1, when they came over to proselytize and to convert people to Catholicism, the Jesuit missionaries learned how to read and speak and write Mandarin Chinese. Now, is that impressive? Yeah. Chinese is one of the most difficult languages in the world to learn. When I was working at Maxwell Air Force Base at the Culture and Language Center, they had classified a language like Spanish as a level 2 for difficulty. Chinese was a level 5. To be fluent in Chinese, you have to know over 20,000 characters. Now, how many characters do we have in the English alphabet? 26. 20,000. And that's not even all the characters in Chinese. They have over 42,000 total. Okay, so it is an incredibly difficult language to learn, and they aren't like phonetic letters. It's a glyphic language, okay? Unlike Korean, which is phonetic, or English, which is phonetic. Did y'all know what the other hardest language in the world, that was also a category 5 up there with Mandarin? English.
Oh, yeah, I think that.
Yep, because we don't follow our own rules. Y'all, English is basically every other language hiding in a trench coat. Okay, we just take rules from random areas. We're like, okay, some Latin, some Greek, some German, some Spanish. We're just going to throw it all together and then see what comes out. We just don't follow our own rules. There's always an exception to one of our rules. Like I before E except after C, how we pronounce the things we spell, like knife. We should be pronouncing that knife. Yeah, knife. I'll die on that hill. It's like, that's how we should just make it happen. We should start pronouncing it, like let it catch on, knife. And then I had some other students who told me some words that they're just like, yeah, no, I always mispronounce it because it's hard. English is hard. Okay, so English and Chinese are up there as the most difficult languages in the world. So instead of making the Chinese learn Portuguese, the Jesuits met them where they were comfortable. They learned how to read and speak Chinese. They also respected Confucianism. Well, wait a minute. I thought that the Jesuits wanted to eradicate heresy. If they wanted to do that, why are they cool with Confucianism? Exactly right. Because Confucianism is a philosophy, not a religion. Okay, so they're not counterintuitive. It's not like they worship Confucius as a god. It's just a way of life. In addition to that, the Jesuits are also going to share their expertise in certain fields. They're going to share education and knowledge about the scientific revolution, about the Enlightenment, and education is highly valued in China. As we saw under the Ming Dynasty, they expanded the national school system. Their bureaucracy is based on a meritocracy, requires education in Confucianist philosophy. So we see that they have a foundation upon which to build rapport. Now, despite this, despite the fact that the Jesuits were so highly respected by the Chinese, even as foreigners, are we going to see a mass conversion to Catholicism in China? Nope, because Catholicism is foreign. We already have Confucianism and Buddhism in China. That must be superior to these foreign religions. Okay, so you don't see a widespread conversion event happening throughout China, even though the Catholics do try. Now, even though Portugal is the first one to establish this maritime empire, they're not going to be able to hold on to it for long. One of the major factors being the size of Portugal. They are not going to have the population, the manpower, or the amount of ships to control an empire of this scale. And other countries are going to start surpassing them. Additionally, their own merchants are going to start undermining the policy of mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is a term that you're going to need to know every single year at LAMP. Can anybody tell me what mercantilism is? Exactly right. There's a mother country, and then there's colonies. The purpose of the colonies is to enrich the mother country. Okay, and you want to export more than you import. Who controls the economy? The mother country, the government of the mother country. All right, so if let's say you're a tobacco farmer in Virginia, which is an English colony, are you supposed to sell that tobacco to whoever you want so that you can become individually wealthy? No. You can't sell it to France if they give you a better price, or to Spain if they give you a better price. You're growing that tobacco for England, the mother country. But some merchants are going to have a problem with this. So in the Portuguese Empire, spice merchants are going to start undermining mercantilism. They're going to start keeping a bit more for themselves, giving themselves a bigger cut in the trade. Now, what this means is that the government is going to be accumulating less revenue, less money. And there's three ways that a government can make money. What are those three T's? Taxes, trade, and tribute. Exactly right. They can't get their revenue through trade because they're being undercut by merchants who want to practice laissez-faire capitalism. And now they start raising taxes. But they don't have a large population to tax, and the government officials become corrupt. And so they're going to start taking a cut of the taxes for themselves. And again, this is going to shrink the treasury for Portugal, which is going to make them eventually have to let go of their maritime empire. So like when I talk about why the Portuguese trading empire fell, you should have bullet points that say Portugal, tiny, not enough people, not enough tax revenue, corruption in the government, merchants undermining mercantilism. Okay, make sure that you're keeping track of that information, because next year it's going to be straight up lecture. You're going to have to learn how to differentiate between what is historically significant and what is not historically significant. Okay, so once the Portuguese get pushed out of the Indian Ocean trade route, we're going to see two other European countries take their place. And these European countries are going to establish joint stock companies. Remember that a joint stock company is where multiple people invest a little bit of money so they can make a profit, rather than one individual investing all of their money and then taking a huge risk of losing all of that money or potentially making a ton more money. So it's a huge risk factor in that. So joint stock companies meant, just put in $100, 100 other people put in $100, and then we can make it to India and get spices and come back and everyone's happy. We talked about East Indies companies. Does anyone remember which two European countries had East Indies companies? No, wasn't Portugal and Spain, because now they're kicked out. The Netherlands is one of them. You have the Dutch East Indies Company. That's one. Dutch East Indies. Then who else? Britain. You have the British East Indies Company. Okay, y'all, those are important terms to know. Dutch East Indies Company and the British East Indies Company. Those are joint stock companies that took over the trade routes and they started competing with the Portuguese. So Portugal's golden age has come and gone. Okay, now it's Britain's turn. All right, so all of that's under the Ming. At the end of the Ming Dynasty, they get rid of the treasure fleet, they increase taxes, things aren't going so well. And we know that when things aren't going well, that tends to lead to what in China? What do the people tend to do? Yeah, they rebel. Because if things aren't going well, that means that the ruler has lost the mandate of heaven. Okay, it's that loophole. If things are going awesome, the gods must be pleased we let them stay in charge. If things aren't going so well, it's time to kick them out. Let's get a new leader.